Hello and welcome to the JCN Clinic podcast show. I'm Jessica and today I'm flying solo because we have Carissa out, we have Rochelle out, and Christine, I think, has something on the cards for this Friday. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to fly solo. We had planned to do a Q&A and you guys sent in a lot of questions. So I thought, let's just jump on. Let's just do this and answer your questions. We had a really nice mix too. So we had some general foodie based stuff come through, some therapeutic dietary stuff come through, some more sort of, I'd say, meaty cases as well. So it's a nice little mix. It's definitely very gut focused. I think for a lot of you listening who love the gut stuff, you'll, as always, get a lot out of this. So yeah, let's dive on in on this Friday afternoon. I might start with some of these foodie based questions first. Best store bought gluten-free bread, please. Wow. Okay. This is a big one, even though it's like kind of simple, but it's not. There is a link on the website for a blog that I put together quite a few years ago. It's still a damn good base resource. So I'm going to make sure I put that in the show notes. So first and foremost, check that out. Now, I guess this firstly comes down to whether we're talking gluten-free bread from a supermarket versus gluten-free bread from a health food store or a bakery. Most of the breads in the supermarket are going to be the same sorts of brands. You're going to have like your Helgas and your Abbotts, some of the home brand varieties, and they're all relatively similar. They're all made with like a mix of different gluten-free flours. They're using yeast as a raising agent. They've got gums and binders in there to hold everything together. A little bit of sugar, maybe egg white. They're not the worst things ever, but also like they do have a lot of like additional ingredients in them, considering it is just a bread compared to what you would get in a health food store. So it's one of those things with gluten-free bread, you really do pay for what you get. I personally, with gluten-free bread, tend to like to buy mine from a health food store if I'm going to buy it, and have some brands that I do like, which I can get into. But I'm also not adverse to, if I'm like needing something quick, I'll grab something from the supermarket. Personally, as far as supermarket options of late, I actually more tend towards I think it's the Liberate brand. By the way, none of this is sponsored. They do more so like gluten-free muffins and crumpets, which I use a lot in the mornings as like pre-running fuel. They work terrifically. And I find that the ingredients in those is pretty good for supermarket produce. Outside of that, realistically, I like to go for brands that when you look at the ingredients, they are more just like flours. The binders don't tend to be excessive. There might be a bit of psyllium and flax or chia in there. It's really nice if you can find something that might have like a sourdough culture, because the flavor in that can be quite nice and it's not relying on yeast as much. Again, this is coming down to the nuances of the gut space. So whether yeast in a bread is a problem or not for you, some people it can be, some people not, depending on the health of their gut. So I personally really love the GF Precinct brand. This is also going to come down to where you live location wise. So I'm in Victoria majority of the time, and that brand is made down here. So it's a little easier for me to get. And their gluten-free breads are delicious. They do rolls and pizza bases. Whereas up in Brisbane, for instance, you can get that, but it's not as easy. So you're going to have different options in those health food stores. I often refer clients to Naturus. That was a brand I really liked. They had some lovely gluten-free bread options. Probably even it's worth mentioning Nodo, who do pretty amazing gluten-free breads for more of like a bready bread, if you've got them nearby to order from. But honestly, like beyond that, I feel like this question is going to come back more to the supermarket. And with a supermarket bread, pretty much like any type of bread, whether it's gluten-free or not, you want to be thinking about getting more of a complex carb, whole grain, option. So look for something that has whole grains as opposed to just white refined, using say like a whole grain brown rice flour, or it might have like a buckwheat flour or like a quinoa flour, instead of things being made just from white rice flour and potato starch and tapioca. So think about that color of the bread and wanting things to be more fibrous, the way you would from buying like a loaf of Wonder White through to a nice sort of wholemeal, lots of seeds in that loaf. We want to go for something similar in the gluten-free vibe. And that's often the best way to think about it from a supermarket vibe. Really getting into the nitty-gritty of it further from there is going to go down to what you need for your gut and what might be problematic for your gut. And that's where realistically that's a whole different ball game of knowing how to decipher that with working with a practitioner. So that hopefully is a good answer for this question. I feel like it was a long answer just based on bread, but essentially I think it's more about guiding you to what to look for in the loaf and in the ingredients, because every supermarket will differ, and maybe just a few brands there to consider. The next question we might dive into is Candida diet. This one is just literally from Charlotte, and it just says Candida diet ... which is quite open. So the Candida diet, the sort of concept of a Candida diet, has been around for quite some time. And it's definitely changed from a practitioner perspective over the years. But I feel like if you get online and you're looking at what AI delivers to you, or the sort of general consensus, it's still very sort of stuck back in the sort of the original days of a Candida diet. So the concept is that you're eating in a way that starves the Candida, that's not giving the Candida as much fuel to feed on. And classically, yeast loves anything with lots of sugar, anything that's like super carbohydrate dense in lots of quantity. It's going to really thrive there. So common things are going to be cakes and biscuits and lollies and syrups, like things from like maple syrup and sugars added into like homemade baking. But it's also going to be with the carbohydrate space, potentially the serve of like the pastas and the rices and the breads and so forth that people are consuming. It can get quite, or it used to get quite strict, and then it would break it down further into certain types of fruits that you should be avoiding, and also even within like the certain types of carbohydrate, grains and so forth, that you should be avoiding. And realistically, this is where things have changed. And again, it becomes more nuanced based on the person, because with a Candida picture, you also need to consider not only the yeast overgrowth, but also the health of the microbiome overall. So we need to consider, if we are taking things out of the diet, how that's going to affect the overall microbiome. And also, it's not always needed to go in with such a heavy-handed approach. Depending on where you're coming from, if you have like a really traditional Western diet and you have soft drink each day, for instance, and you eat a lot of maybe chockies or lollies in the afternoon, cleaning that up and reducing sugar just from that perspective is a really big, impactful change, versus someone that has like a really good whole food foundation and has like rampant Candida and needs to potentially knuckle down more. But essentially, the more you strip back through diet, you're going to compromise the overall microbiome. So working with a practitioner through this is really important. And also, Candida diets, or a diet around any form of yeast overgrowth, does need to be combated with working with a supplement regime of treatment, because if you're just following the diet alone, all that's going to happen is that you're going to have less symptoms on the diet, but as soon as you go back on a variety of foods, you're going to experience symptoms. So the answer isn't just to restrict the diet. The answer is to work with someone to have a therapeutic dietary approach, but make sure you're working on reduction of Candida in the system, and that good balance of microbes within the gut overall, so that you can bring in more variety again without symptoms. So the thing with the Candida diet is that it needs to be individualized to the person. I have some clients who have really intensive, invasive yeast issues, and their diet will definitely look different to someone that might have some just like very basic, very mild Candida. And a lot of that has to do with, again, the ecology of their gut overall, where they're at in their health story, how systemic the Candida is. So I think at the end of the day, surprise, surprise, it's not just as simple as like typing in to Google Candida diet, and then following it from there, because you need to think about the long-term effects. And I can definitely promise you that if you just do that and then you follow something like that online, all that's going to happen is that when you start to go back to regular food and diversity, is symptoms are going to flare up again. So hopefully that helps. Next on the agenda, can you thrive on a vegan diet? We have talked in the past also on the podcast about the vegan diet. So again, very, very individualized here. You definitely can thrive on a vegan diet depending on your constitution, depending on how well you absorb your overall nutrition from your food. And then obviously that comes down to your gut health, how your individual microbiome footprint looks, and your ability to deal with a higher impact of fiber through a vegan diet. Very much an individualized question. Some people will definitely do better than the next person. I know for myself, when I was in my early 20s, for probably 4 to 5 years, I followed a vegan diet, and I definitely, in retrospect, did not feel well, as in I wasn't thriving. But that brings me to the next point in this. It depends on what the vegan diet looks like. You can hit all of your requirements, 95% of them, through your vegan diet, if you understand food, if you know how to get enough protein, if you know how to get enough of the nutrients that are often on the lower end through a vegan diet. Carbohydrates and fiber variety usually isn't an issue. Even fats, depending again on how well you're eating, aren't an issue, but protein can be really deficient if you don't know what you're doing and how to get enough protein day to day, week to week. Same to be said with getting enough iron. Like, are you getting enough from a plant-based diet? Do you need to supplement? And then, of course, B12 is a biggie as well. Calcium, depending on your intake of calcium through a vegan diet. So it really does take knowledge. And I have vegan clients that do really well and understand this. I've also had clients come to me over the years who are vegan and are just in an absolute world of hurt because they're just not doing it correctly. And even just keeping them vegan and teaching them how to eat well as a vegan is just taking them leaps and bounds. But I do definitely know I've seen people transition from a vegan style of eating onto, say, a pescatarian, or like just eating all versions of meat, and they've felt like they've thrived from there. So I think, again, that's been very constitution based and what their system specifically has needed. It's one that I just think, if you want to be vegan, you really need to do your research. And I think it's so worth investing in spending some money on seeing someone who can at least guide you initially and make sure that you're ticking all of the boxes. I feel like, again, for myself, that's where I know I went wrong when I was younger. Like, if I had have understood what a vegan diet looked like through a healthy lens, it would have been a different picture, because it wasn't fruit for breakfast on its own and then a lentil pie from the bakery for lunch, and dinner. What would dinner have been? Maybe some nachos and then half a block of chocolate for dessert. Something along those vibes, washed down by a couple of ciders. So there is a good way and not such a good way. Okie doke. Let's move on to the next question from Katie. Cow pat poos. What's going on with that? And is there long-term serious health impacts? Katie, we see a lot of this at the clinic. It's relatively common for us working in the gut space. So the cow pat poo, I often refer to that term myself, so I like that you use that, is showing us that that stool is obviously not formed. And for that to happen, it can be a multitude of factors. When stools are loose, they're moving through too quickly with too much fluid. And usually that can be a result of anything on this. It can be stress. So stress, let's definitely lay that one on the table. But from a gut perspective, it can be driven by food intolerances or reactivity, some form of sensitivity that your system, your immune system in your gut is reacting to, and creating that expulsion of said food and contents. And also because of like the inflammatory cascade that can occur in reaction to food sensitivities. Also, the other aspect is your microbiome health. So depending on what your microbiome looks like, there can be certain microbial overgrowth or imbalance situations. Even back to our chat earlier about Candida is a classic one where we can see a looseness to the stool because of these inflammatory imbalances. So from my perspective, I tend to see a bit of a combination where there's been maybe some long-term food sensitivities that have led to that dysbiotic gut, like lots of imbalances in the gut. And as a result, the actual microbiome itself has become aggravated, imbalanced, inflamed. So we've kind of got both sides of the coin going on there. And that both of these factors are contributing to the looseness of the stool. So it's pretty common. And as far as it being long-term serious health impacts, look, I don't think that you need to worry about anything like really serious. Definitely, we need to consider, is there blood in the stool? If there's mucus in the stool, like have you had this investigated further? If it's been going on for a long time, depending on other symptoms, ruling out that there's not, say, a high calprotectin there, which is a marker from a stool test that might tell us there is some acute inflammation. So yeah, we do need to rule out anything that might be going on a more serious level. And that can be done through your GP or a gastroenterologist, or even seeing your practitioner who may refer you if they think that that's required. But honestly, majority of the time, it isn't anything to that degree. More the health impacts would be that your absorption from your food isn't as sort of well-rounded as it should be when things are kind of rushing through a little quicker. So what we tend to see is people just feel not as great as they could. So they feel a little bit more poor in energy, just feel a little bit off. Like usually, if this is happening, it means that there's inflammation in the gut, and inflammation in the gut just has like this huge, profound knock on systemically. So it can just come with so many other factors where it might be local gut symptoms with like just discomfort in general around bloating and gas and grumbling tummy, all sorts of different factors. But it could also come with like systemic stuff like headaches and joint aches and pains and skin issues. So it really, when you talk about long-term serious health impacts, like there absolutely can be health impacts, but it's just about where on that ladder of seriousness you place that. Obviously, a lot of those things can be really debilitating to your life. And that's why, we love what we do at the clinic, because helping people feel better has a big impact. And I guess that's where it's like, well, where do you put the weight in a word like serious? But I do think with this question, we need to consider, could this be something sinister? There is a very, very, very small percentage of chance. And if there is a concern and it's been going on for a long time, then definitely go see a GP, get a stool test as far as calprotectin goes, and then potentially that might lead to a referral to a gastroenterologist, scopes, etc. Most of the people we see that come to the clinic who are experiencing this, we are seeing have some lovely well-formed stools with the right treatment. So I would say again, majority of the time, it's just about treating the gut accordingly. I think we've got time for one more question. There's more here, but I want to keep this short and sharp. So we have one here from Melinda. It's like a 3-part question. She says, celiac hubby had bowel resection 10 years ago due to cancer and still seems to struggle to consume legumes and pulses without excessive wind and can't stop pooing. Any suggestions for how he can improve this? Holy moly, this is a biggie. Okay, so in a nutshell, for those that don't understand, a bowel resection means that her hubby has had some of his bowel removed. So this is where things get a little bit more tricky. Depending on like the extent of the bowel resection, we're going to have like less of an environment for her husband's microbiome. So his actual microbiome count is probably quite low. And even this is where this would be interesting with a stool test, because stool tests are measuring your results against like the average normal healthy gut. And I don't, it's not like we have data against what an average healthy gut who's had a bowel resection looks like. And that I would very much take an educated assumption that his microbiome sort of diversity and richness would be quite low just naturally, because of like the real estate isn't the same for it to thrive. So that means that if we don't have as much diversity and richness, that he's not going to have those microbes there in the same numbers to help with like the breakdown and fermentation of all of those rich fibers and prebiotics in foods like legumes and pulses, which are so good for us, but they are super, super high in these, these beautiful prebiotic compounds that microbes really munch away and feed on. So what I would say is going on here is that due to the lack of that diversity and richness, that he literally doesn't have the sort of microbial building blocks to deal with that type of food. So as a response, he's getting like this heightened wind, and then it's really aggravating his gut, and he's getting like this increased bowel movements. Potentially, like the last question, they're probably quite loose, I would say. It's like sometimes you can have a really low diversity, but he could also have quite a strong overgrowth of some more adverse microbes within that smaller diversity picture. And then that might also be playing into why he's getting these types of responses. I do think, like, if it was for me, if I was seeing someone like this, I'd still be very interested in something like a stool test. I just would have to like look at it with a different lens, considering like what his bowel resection looked like. But it could still tell us a lot about the general diversity picture, like what microbes are in his gut, and different inflammatory markers, how well he's actually breaking down food. So as far as any suggestions of how he can improve this, like honestly, I would be booking in and seeing someone. Like, this isn't an easy answer. This is knowing what's going on in his microbiome and in his gut overall, and being able to treat that accordingly. And there's a chance that he's probably going to need a particular type of dietary intake to suit him, depending on what that looks like, because he's not going to potentially ever have the same load of microbes in his gut as the average person. So his diet may need to look a little different from the average person. But that's what we would need to work out through working with someone like this. I do definitely believe that absolutely we could get him feeling better, like without question. There's no doubt that there's some issues going on here. It's just figuring out what they are. And also, this is like a cancer related situation. So we're also potentially dealing with the implications of things like radiation and immunotherapy, and how that may have impacted, will have impacted his microbiome and his immune system too. So there's multiple layers at play. So yeah, as far as improvements or how to improve, book him into the clinic, Melinda, like honestly. So I think I'm going to pull it up there. Actually, I might just hint at this one because this is an easy referral to a past podcast. We had someone ask, how do I help my daughter's acne without going down the medication path as per GP recommendations, I think. So we did a podcast literally just 1 or 2 episodes ago on acne, and we had Danny from Bobby Charles on with us. Go and have a listen to that. It's a really good deep dive into acne in all aspects. So all of the answers and more you'll find there. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this solo episode. It was fun to do, actually. It just gets a little hard talking constantly. You'd think I'd be used to it from clinic, but it just seems to feel like it's a different level. As I said when I started, it is a Friday afternoon here. I have already done my training for the day, so I think I'm going to get ready for the weekend ahead and the long run ahead tomorrow. But thanks for listening, guys, as always. I'm sure we'll have Carissa back with us soon. As a result of Carissa not being on this, I guess this has been quite PG. We haven't had any of the F-bombs. But if you have any topics you would like us to chat about or any questions, absolutely let us know. So that all being said, I hope you have a fabulous afternoon, evening, morning, whenever you're listening to this, and we will catch you next time. Bye.